Donald Trump has brought us to the brink of a possible direct military confrontation with Iran over the last few days by illegally assassinating one of Iran's top generals, one of their top military commanders, with drone strikes in Iraq. And so we're clear about the events that led up to this illegal assassination that Trump ordered. This didn't just come out of nowhere. This has been building and escalating for years, really, but it started to ramp up over the last few weeks. The protest in Iraq to get U.S. troops out of their country, because we've been there for 16 years, committing mass murder and war crimes on a regular basis. 1 million, like I mentioned before, 1 million Iraqi civilians dead, millions more fleeing their homes, created a giant refugee crisis. The country's unstable. There's no stability in the government, and the infrastructure's fucked up. The country is in dire straits, and that is because of U.S. imperialism and our illegal war that we started in the country. So rightfully, the people in Iraq have been protesting our presence there. The recent elections have moved the government more siding with Iran and more opposition to U.S. presence in Iraq. So now the citizens and the government are kind of on the same page now. Then there was a suicide bombing which killed a U.S. defense contractor, and now sources in the U.S. are saying that the people responsible for that attack were part of this faction of Hezbollah, the group that largely operates in Gaza and the West Bank. This faction operates in Iraq and I believe Syria. So in response to the U.S. defense contractor being killed, Trump orders airstrikes in Iraq and Syria against the wishes of both governments. They both told him not to do it because it was going to be a dramatic escalation, and it will be a disproportionate response to the claims that the U.S. was making. Trump did this airstrikes anyway. That caused these the riot outside of the U.S. embassy in Baghdad, which led Trump to send in the Marines and send thousands of troops and order the evacuation of U.S. personnel, diplomatic personnel in Iraq. Then yesterday we find out that an airstrike Donald Trump ordered in Iraq killed the Iranian, one of Iran's top military commanders. Now, Trump is claiming that this was entirely defensive in nature, the assassination of the military commander. He says that he was planning an attack on U.S. personnel, and the assassination was to prevent a war. Many things to say about that. First, haven't we heard this before? We're doing this offensive military action because we're doing it in defense of our country. We're only doing it in defense. Even if it's preemptive, it's always in the defense of the United States. That is always a convenient excuse. They use that excuse when they illegally invaded Iraq, which was the catalyst of all of this. Bush administration lied through their teeth, tried to tie the Iraqi government to the 9/11 terrorist attacks. Even though they knew it wasn't true, they tried to pretend like Iraq had weapons of mass destruction and they were going to use them on the United States. Both of those things were lied. So the whole war in Iraq, second longest war in U.S. history, been there 16 years, all of it was based on the lie that we were doing it in defense of the country. So forgive me if I don't believe Trump's lying ass when he comes and says, oh, this assassination that can be considered a declaration of war, we did that in defense of the country. That's a convenient excuse that people use all the time, and it sounds like bullshit. Next point I want to make is, really, that's the first for me. The Trump administration they took action to prevent a war with Iran, because it's funny that they say that, because every action that they've taken in regards to Iran since they've come into the White House has been provocative, has been antagonistic, and it's been moving us closer, inching us closer to a war with Iran ever since they got into the White House. So again, I don't believe you when you come out and say this was defensive and this was to prevent a war with Iran. Because everything else speaks to the contrary. Everything else says that you did this as just another step to move us closer to war with Iran. Just like ripping up the Iran nuclear deal. Just like putting those illegal sanctions on Iran. Just like staging attacks and blaming Iran for them, which they've done already. All of those things have been to move us closer to war with Iran. Now, everyone around the world who's paying attention to this story is anxiously waiting to see what happens next, because understand this. There's no way that Donald Trump assassinating a top military commander in Iran happens without retaliation. They're not just going to let that shit slide. Imagine if Iran or any other country that we don't like assassinated one of our top national security officials. There would be no question. There would be no doubt. It wouldn't be up in the air, off rip from the jump. We would take that as a declaration of war, and we would retaliate with an all-out military assault. That is such an offensive and antagonistic. If that were to happen to one of the top national security officials here in the United States, you'd be hard-pressed to find non-interventionists, some of the most anti-war people in the country, saying that a military response wouldn't be appropriate. Because that's the exact kind of scenario where non-interventionists make an exception and say military action is warranted because it would be in response to an attack. It would be defensive in nature. So it really is almost inevitable that the Iranian government will launch some sort of military attack on U.S. bases or U.S. personnel or U.S. officials or one of our allies. So if/when Iran does respond with an attack of their own, that attack will not go unanswered by the U.S. Like it or not, that attack will not go unanswered, and then we would find ourselves in the middle of a all-out war between the United States and Iran. And a war of that magnitude would be an unmitigated disaster, rivaling, if not almost definitely, it will surpass the epic debacle that has been the Iraq War. An illegal war we started 16 years ago that has led to the deaths of 1 million civilians in Iraq, caused millions and millions of refugees to pour out of the Middle East and into other places around the world like Europe, and the reverberating consequences invading Iraq, things like the huge surge in the amount of radical extremist jihadist groups throughout the Middle East, as well as a rise in terrorist attacks that are directly correlated. If we didn't disband the Iraqi military, ISIS would have never had some of the top military commanders that they had. So the rise of ISIS and Al-Qaeda came about as reverberating consequences from invading Iraq. If we were to ever go to war with Iran, the consequences would be much, much worse. Iran has a much, much larger population than Iraq, so that means even more civilian casualties, even larger refugee crisis. Iran, without question, has the most capable military in the region. They have better equipment than the Iraqi military did. They are better trained than the Iraqi military was, and their numbers are multiple times larger than the Iraqi military when we invaded back in 2003. So all those things also mean there will be a much higher civilian casualty rate than what we saw in Iraq. But it also means that more U.S. troops and more U.S. contractors and more U.S. allies will end up dying because they will actually be fighting against a military that can buck back, that can put up a fight. More than that, if you thought there was a surge in jihadist organizations and terrorist attacks post the invasion of Iraq in 2003, that number will increase by an order of magnitude if the Iranian government were to collapse, like what happened in Iraq after we overthrew Saddam Hussein. Because understand, Iran is the Shia stronghold in the Middle East. All of these radical jihadist terrorist groups in the Middle East, overwhelming majority of them they're all Sunni Muslims, but some of them are Salafists, some of them are Wahhabists, and there are distinctions, but they are Sunni, and their main enemy, their adversary in the region, almost natural enemy, would be the Shia Muslims who they've been warring with for hundreds of years. People who are ignorant about this, they think that groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, they think that their main goal, their main objective is to attack the U.S. and destroy the United States and destroy Western countries. That isn't their main goal at all. a lot of the animosity that they have towards the West is because we keep meddling in their affairs and we keep doing war crimes and illegal wars and overthrowing their governments. That's where a lot of their animosity towards the West comes from. The real beef, the natural beef in the Middle East is between the Sunnis and the Shias. The main opposition that they face, that these jihadist groups face, it's not the United States and it's not our allies, because a lot of the time it turns out that we're funding those radical jihadists. Their main opposition comes from the Shia Muslims, like Iran. Iran is one of the main forces who are helping push back against the rise of ISIS in Syria. If there were a war between the US and Iran and the Iranian government did fall, then you would essentially take the brakes out of the car. There is almost no opposition to the rise of Wahhabism and Salafism and jihadism that is on the rise in the Middle East, because the main opposition, which is Iran, their government would no longer exist. And you would see a lot more territories completely taken over by ISIS, similar to what happened with Raqqa, Syria, and Mosul, Iraq. More than that, Iran is not that far off from being able to build a nuclear weapon. If there is open military conflict between the US and Iran, there is literally nothing stopping them from resuming or their nuclear weapons program. And if they have if they build a nuclear weapon, first, now you have the possibility of a nuke being used somewhere in the Middle East. But even if they don't use it, say we prevent them from using it and we overthrow the government, then what? Then the country falls into chaos. There will be jihadists who take over parts of Iran. And then you risk the possibility of nuclear weapons falling into the hands of radical Salafist jihadists like ISIS. Imagine if a group like ISIS or Al-Qaeda, as reckless and indifferent to human life as they are, imagine if they had a nuclear weapon. We're looking at a whole new world. All these things are possibilities if there was open military conflict between the US and Iran. We're not there yet. There are other less aggressive responses that Iran can do in retaliation to this assassination of one of their top commanders. They could block shipping routes for trade around the world. They could retaliate with a cyber attack, or they can directly fund and arm groups that are in open conflict with the US government, like the Houthi rebels in Yemen. Or they could try to attack the infrastructure of one of our allies in the region. There are different ways to that Iran has and can possibly retaliate to US aggression. But like I said earlier at the beginning of this video, this has gotten to the point where there is almost no equal and opposite response that Iran can take to assassination of one of their top commanders, short of military action. And like I said, if Iran takes military action, the US is not going to let that go unanswered.